Hello, thank you. I am Okelo Christopher. Thank you for participating in this discussion once again. And today we shall be handling contract of sale of goods still. And under this contract of sale of goods, we shall be looking at a rule called the caveat emptor. The caveat emptor rule, it protects the sellers from liability. It protects the sellers from liability to some extent. As we all know, that every general rule or every principle has their every principle have their exceptions or limitations. So the principle of caveat emptor, it means that let the buyer beware. So it's your duty as the buyer, once you're purchasing any item, it is your duty to ask whatever question you want to inquire regarding that good you're purchasing. You have to ask the seller in detail whether you're buying a shirt, a shoe, or even a tie, car, any item, any goods which is being governed by the Sale of Goods and Supply of Services Act. This goods should be movable. So the caveat emptor rule, it states that let buyer beware. That is what it means. It is the duty of the buyer to be careful while purchasing goods of this specification. On receiving the goods, the buyer has the right to fully examine, and he has the right to reject the goods. Upon examination, you have the right to reject. That is your right as the buyer. So once you accept that good and later finds out a defect which could have been detected upon examination, then the caveat emptor rule will come into play. Thus, you cannot reject that good. You cannot reject that good, but you can only sue for damages. But you are not required to reject the goods. That is the principle of the caveat emptor. So once you go out there and you want to purchase any product of your wish, make sure you examine them carefully. And don't be shy to reject. It is your right. Because once you accept that good with its defect, you will hold liability. The seller will not be held liable. You can look at the case of Ward versus Hobbs. Ward versus Hobbs. Ward is WARD and Hobbs is HOBBS. It's a case of 1878. In this case, the parties entered into a contract. The buyer purchased some pigs from the seller, not knowing that the pigs were sick of typhoid, as the fact says. The buyer bought the pigs, went with them to his place, but later the pigs died. All the pigs died. So the buyer sued the seller. However, the court stated that the seller, in this case, the seller was not bound to disclose that the pigs were unhealthy. The seller was not bound to disclose that. Caveat emptor being the rule, the buyer could not claim damages as he ought to have examined the pigs before accepting them. So you have to rely on your examination and on your judgment. Once you relied on them, you cannot even sue for damages because you examined the goods and you relied on your judgment and skill. You can look at the Ugandan case of Bakaine versus Yuasa Investment Limited. It's a case of 2014, High Court Civil Suit 136. The court stated that when a buyer purchases goods, depending on his judgment or skill, he is himself responsible. So you examine the goods, you relied on your judgment, therefore you cannot bring a suit against the seller. Where such a buyer does not make any inquiry regarding the goods he is purchasing, the seller is not bound to disclose any or every defect in that good. So it's your duty to ask, to inquire about the goods you intend to have, you intend to have ownership of from the seller. Or else the seller is not bound to disclose any defect to you as the buyer. So, as any other rule, we also have exceptions to this rule, the caveat emptor rule. The first exception is where the seller makes a misrepresentation, where the seller makes a representation, and the buyer believes in that statement made. Maybe you'd say, this is a cotton material, and the seller goes out and finds it's a different material. It's a different material. The buyer can sue for the damages. Where there has been fraud, that is the second exceptions. Where there has been fraud within the transactions, yeah, and where the defect in the goods was concealed, so as so as the defect is not to be discovered. Where it is proven that the seller in any way hid the defect in that good intentionally, then the caveat emptor rule will not protect the seller from liability. Where the condition on the contract deals with quality, but the seller deviates from that condition, the seller will not be protected by this rule. Where goods are being sold by description but do not respond to